When the board voted to strip me of my own authority, my son, the boy I once carried in my arms, didn't look at me. Not even once. It wasn't until the auditor laid down the report he'd falsified that I saw his eyes tremble. I just said, slowly, "Ethan, you forgot. I know where everything is buried." And the room fell silent. But before we go on, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from. And remember to subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. Now then, let me take you back to when everything was still peaceful, before the storm began. I still remember that moment. The thick, heavy silence in that conference room. And when the door finally closed behind them, I found myself standing in front of a void, one far larger than any vote could have created. Maybe that's why when I tell this story I have to start before all that. Back when things were still steady, before I realized my only son was slowly drifting off the path I thought we'd walk together. I'm Richard Hale, 62, a man who spent almost his whole life building Hale Works out of a cold little garage during a Denver winter. Back then, Ethan was just 4. I can still see him playing with old boxes of parts, those tiny hands covered in metal dust, smiling at me like the whole world was just the two of us. I never imagined those afternoons would become the memories I'd cling to when the future started to crack. My wife passed 8 years ago, a quiet morning, so fast I didn't get to say a single decent thing to her. After that, it was just me and Ethan, the two of us leaning on each other trying to move forward. I thought loss would bring us closer, and for a long time, it did. Ethan followed me to trade shows, stood behind the booth, eyes shining whenever a new prototype came out. He used to say he wanted to take over someday, make me proud, and I believed him. When he earned his MBAI, made him COO. He worked well, fast, sometimes reckless, but full of fire. I figured time would season him. I planned to start handing things over slowly, no rush. But somewhere along the way, a distance crept in, quiet, subtle. Just different looks, shorter words, colder tones. I could hear calculation slipping into his voice, even though he still called me Dad, clearly enough. On so many nights, sitting alone in my office, I wondered what I'd missed. Maybe I spent too much time on the business forgetting Ethan was growing up right in front of me. Or maybe the loss we shared had quietly spun him in another direction. Nobody teaches you how to be a father inside a company worth $70 million. And no one teaches you how to handle it when the only child you have stops walking beside you. I didn't know it then. But while I still thought everything could be fixed, Ethan had already stepped onto another road. A road I never expected him to choose. The change became clear on a morning that should have been ordinary. I came in like I always did, made myself a weak cup of coffee, sat down with the weekly reports. Ethan walked in, polite as ever, but his eyes, the warmth I knew, just wasn't there. He sat across from me, fingers-laced voice steady and light, as if he were talking about the weather. "Dad, maybe you should think about retiring a few years early. The company needs a younger image." I put the report down, trying to keep my voice calm. I didn't blame him, but something in the way he chose those words, the precision of it, left a cold trace on my spine. It wasn't the content. It was the fact that he wasn't asking. He was informing me. I thought it was a moment of impulse. But a few days later, during a strategy meeting, Ethan cut me off twice. He did it so naturally, like it was already a habit. The whole room went quiet for a few seconds, then everyone carried on, leaving me feeling like a stranger wandering through a company with my own name on the door. Then the whispers started. I overheard a couple of employees talking in the hallway, soft voices but loud enough to reach me. "Ethan will probably take over soon." I didn't want to believe it, but a father's instinct doesn't let you look away. One night I returned to the office for some documents. My door was locked, something that had never happened. While I was still puzzled, Ethan stepped out from inside. He smiled, that light smile that never touched his eyes. Just reorganizing a bit. "Dad." I glanced past him and saw my desk shifted. Files moved, things just slightly out of place. And something inside me slipped like a small screw in a machine that had been loosening for years. In that moment, I could have seen the truth. But I didn't want to believe that the son I'd raised all these years was looking at me as an obstacle that needed to be moved aside. I walked out of that dark hallway that night with a slow burn running down my spine. It wasn't fear. No, it was something sharper, bitter in a way only time can make. like I'd just seen a tiny crack in a wall I'd spent 40 years building, and I knew sooner or later that crack would spread. But it didn't wait. It spread the very next day. Ethan started small. So small that if I hadn't been paying attention, I might have called it coincidence. But I've lived long enough in a world built on quiet decisions to know nothing is ever random. That Monday morning meeting, when I presented my plan to improve the production line, something I'd been shaping for months, Ethan stood up, straightened his tie, and said, "Calm as still water, Dad. That idea's getting old. We need something bolder." I stayed silent. The whole room looked at me, waiting for a reaction, while Ethan kept staring at the screen like I was some distant colleague he barely remembered. I heard someone shuffling papers, a pen tapping the table, and under those small sounds I felt one truth settling. In the line between father and son was fading, and being replaced by a line between two sides, my side and his. But that was only the first rung on the ladder. A week later, I got a copy of an internal email, one Ethan had sent to the strategy team. The last line was written with a firmness that felt almost spotlighted. "We need a CEO who looks to the future, not the past." My name was in CC, not by accident. I knew that. He wanted me to read it. He wanted me to understand. And he wanted me to stay quiet. I sat there for a long while, staring at the screen. I remembered his little shoulders when he was a boy, running to show me his messy drawing of a future factory he dreamt up. I remembered him saying he wanted to be CEO someday, so Dad can rest. Back then, he said it with the clear eyes of a child. Now, those eyes wanted me out. Then Ethan began touching the things I valued most. He proposed cutting the testing division, the one I'd built from two young engineers, the place that sparked our first breakthrough. He explained it in a soft, casual tone. "That department drains the budget. It's unnecessary now." I asked Ethan, "Have you looked at the quality reports?" He just shrugged, like numbers were someone else's problem. I stayed calm. But when I saw the proposal to cut the community program my wife had devoted herself to, I knew Ethan wasn't just testing power. He was proving something. To whom, the board, the staff himself, I didn't know. I only knew it hurt in a way business never had. Another afternoon, I walked into a strategy meeting and found everyone already there. I checked my watch. The meeting started at 3. It was only 2:45. A young director stood up, awkward eyes shifting. COO Ethan asked us to start earlier because you're usually busy with other things." I understood. I didn't need a long explanation. Ethan was trying to make it feel like I wasn't the center anymore. When I sat down, they continued as if I were just listening in. I kept taking notes, kept my attention steady, but inside there was only a deep, heavy quiet. Not anger, not jealousy, just a truth clear enough to chill the bones. My son was trying to push me aside, and the blows got heavier when Ethan demanded full access to every financial record. CFO. Thomas stopped by my office at the end of the day, standing in the doorway like a man carrying a burden. "Richard, Ethan's asking for full financial access. Everything, including the sections only the CEO usually sees." I looked at him. Thomas had worked with me 23 years. I knew the worry in his eyes was real. Should I grant it, Richard? I set my pen down. I could have denied it. I could have blocked every line with a single signature. But if I did, Ethan would know I was watching. I needed to see how far he'd go. "Give it to him," I said, steady. "I want to see what he does with it." Thomas exhaled, the kind of breath a man lets out when he senses a storm on the horizon. Things kept escalating. Not in giant leaps, but in dozens of small, relentless steps. Ethan started meeting board members privately. I heard about late-night dinners, quiet promises, hushed conversations, stretching past midnight. Familiar faces began looking at me with caution, something they'd never shown me in all these decades. One morning, PR sent over a draft of the new branding campaign. The first page read, "A young leader guiding Haleworks into the future." The photo showed Ethan standing in the center of the factory floor, arms crossed. I wasn't in it, not even in the background. I set the pages down and breathed slowly. The path he'd chosen was getting clearer. But what cut deepest was the whisper from an old assistant. He came to me in the parking lot, voice low enough to be carried off by a breeze. "Mr. Hale, Ethan's holding closed door talks about the CEO succession plan. Your name isn't part of the main discussion." I thanked him. Then I stood there for a long moment, surrounded by engines revving and the pale yellow of streetlights on concrete. I wasn't angry. I just felt a kind of hollow, too large to name. He didn't just want the position. He wanted to replace me completely. But all of that, all those small cuts, they were still cold blows. Until one weekend night I heard something that sank deeper than any of them. I came to the office late to pick up some files. As I passed the small meeting room, I heard Ethan's voice inside. Not calm, not light, but lower, firmer. My dad's outdated. I'll take over soon. I froze outside the door, just a few seconds, but they stretched like a year. Sometimes in life, the pain isn't from being betrayed. It's from realizing the person doing it is the one you never imagined would. I stood still, staring at the nameplate on the door, Ethan Hale, COO, and I felt something in me close. That night, I sat alone in my office. The photo of my wife rested beside the paperweight she gave me the day we opened the new building. I placed my hand on the frame. I asked, softly, to no one, how could our son treat us like this? No answer. Just the warm glow of the lamp reflecting on the glass. And then came the final rung, the one that took everything to the bottom. In the board meeting, Ethan stood with perfect confidence like he'd rehearsed for months. We need to discuss the transfer of the CEO role, he said, plain and sharp. I propose a vote. I lifted my head and looked straight at him. No anger, no expression, just listening. 4 out of 7 board members leaned his way, a number that said everything. Ethan met my eyes, and they were so cold, so distant, I couldn't find the child I once held in them anymore. It's time for you to step back, Dad. You've done enough. In that moment, I wasn't a CEO. I wasn't a founder. I was just a father, standing in front of a decision his son had crafted with great care. And I understood. With a certainty so quiet, it felt like the room itself stopped breathing. Ethan had chosen a path, one he could never come back from. Thomas pulled me into the small side office next to the boardroom, the one lit by that dim yellow lamp that made his face look pale, older by 10 years. The door hadn't even finished closing when he raised a finger to his lips, asking for silence. I didn't understand, but I stayed still, waited for him to catch his breath. Then he opened his old laptop, his hands shaking as he typed the password, like one wrong touch might bring everything crashing down. I can't let you keep walking in the dark, he said, voice breaking. I've been working with Ethan for the past 6 months, and there are things you haven't seen. I leaned back against the wall, keeping my tone steady. Thomas, if there's something to say, just say it. I've had enough of half-truths. The screen lit up, and I recognized the numbers immediately. Last quarter's revenue report. The same one Ethan used to prove that a younger leadership team was outperforming the old guard. But the figures danced strangely across the page, wrong in a way that prickled under my skin. Thomas zoomed in on each line, explaining between heavy breaths. These numbers, they're inflated. Ethan counted unsigned contracts as revenue, and added a few projections that don't exist. I looked at him, a cold ripple running down my spine. He knows what that kind of manipulation leads to. Doesn't he? Thomas nodded. It gets worse. He opened another folder and pulled up a contract, flagged in red. A deal worth $18 million. The risk clause could cost the company $12 million if the partner backs out. Ethan hid it from the board and from you. My throat tightened, not from anger, but from something deeper, a kind of hollow that touched the bottom of the soul. For 6 months, I'd tried to keep my distance, to let my son grow into the man he wanted to be. But I never imagined he'd choose this path. Thomas looked at me, eyes wet, voice barely holding together. Ethan thinks doing this will prove he's capable, he said. He wanted you to see that his generation isn't weak. I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling my heartbeat slow, heavy enough to pull me toward the floor. And in that quiet second, I understood this wasn't a family dispute anymore. It was a fracture. One mistake away from dragging the company and whatever bond I had left with my son straight into the abyss. When I opened my eyes, Thomas had stepped back, as if afraid he'd destroyed something that couldn't be rebuilt. I only said one thing, my voice rough but steady. Ethan isn't just betraying me. He's tearing down the empire I spent 40 years building. I walked out of Thomas's office with slow, steady steps, giving my heartbeat time to settle before touching any decision. The truth he'd just laid out felt like I'd slipped out of my own life. But instead of anger or demanding answers, I chose the one thing Ethan could never predict from me: silence. Not the silence of a man giving up, but the quiet of someone who's weathered too many storms to be shaken by one more. The next few days, I made myself slow down, When Ethan brought up the idea of transferring power, I nodded gently as if I'd finally accepted reality. Maybe you're right, I said, my voice flat. Maybe it's time for me to think about retiring. Just one sentence, but enough to make his shoulders drop in relief. The tension melted from his eyes, and that was exactly what I needed. Meanwhile, Thomas kept sending more documents, emails, edited spreadsheets, little notes Ethan had asked him to clean up so they're easier to read. I didn't tell Thomas what I planned. The fear already sitting in his eyes was plenty. He didn't need more weight. That afternoon I sat with my private attorney, the man who'd walked beside me for more than 2 decades. He flipped through the contracts Ethan had signed, his face darkening with every page. These terms... No experienced executive would agree to this, he muttered. But the loopholes are so large that if we chose to, we could frame this as serious misconduct. I said softly, not yet. The next day, I arranged a casual meeting with 2 senior board members, men who had stood by me when this company was nothing more than a cold room and a few stubborn dreams. We talked about the weather-old deals, discipline, and leadership. Then I left them with a line light as breath. Ethan seems a bit rushed lately. Sometimes I worry he's getting overconfident. I didn't offer evidence. Didn't explain. Doubt, when planted at the right moment, grows on its own. In the meetings that followed, I gave Ethan the entire stage. I sat at the far end of the table, hands folded, eyes calm. The more confident he became, the sharper his voice grew. We can't let the older generation hold us back forever, he said to the whole leadership team, as if I were nothing but a shadow. This company needs vision, not memories. Every word cut through the past we once shared, but I kept my face steady, as if none of it touched me. Some people glanced my way, waiting for a reaction. I simply nodded, cool and final. I knew Ethan mistook that silence for surrender. I could see pride blooming in his eyes, a confidence only a man standing on solid ground can have. Unaware the edge is just one step behind him. What Ethan didn't know was that the tiny recorder sitting among my folders, something I'd carried since the tough negotiations back in the 90s, was already running. No one noticed it. No one heard my heart growing colder. And certainly, Ethan had no idea. Every word he spoke was being recorded. The day of the vote came on a colder morning than usual, even though the California sky was still clear, as always. I arrived early, sat in the last row, and watched each face walk into the room one by one. Ethan came in last. New suit, that confident smile he wore like a habit. He greeted everyone, shook hands, looking every bit like a young man about to claim a crown. When the room settled, the chair of the board spoke formal and steady. Today we'll vote on who will hold the CEO position for the coming term. Ethan stood right away, like he'd been waiting his whole life for that single cue. I believe this company needs a strong shift, he said, his eyes brushing past me for just a heartbeat. And I'm ready to lead Hale and Company forward. A few board members nodded. The air leaned in his direction. I didn't react, didn't speak. I just rested my hand on the thick folder I'd brought, heavy not because of the pages, but because of what lived inside them. The chair began reading the voting procedure. That was when I rose to my feet. Before we vote, I said, my voice so even it felt almost foreign to me, there are documents that must be reviewed. I set the folder down on the walnut table. The sound cracked through the quiet room. At that same moment, the back door opened, and 3 people in gray suits stepped in, independent auditors I'd quietly brought in 3 days earlier. Whispers broke out. Ethan turned, and that confident smile of his, stretched tight, almost brittle. I opened the folder, turned the first page. These are the quarterly revenue reports, I said slowly. Reports that were falsified and bear the signature of Ethan Hale. The room froze for half a second. I laid out the comparison sheets, the original numbers and the altered ones, each red mark cutting through the page like a wound. One board member had to take off his glasses just to see clearly, eyes wide. This, I continued, shows, he asked the finance team to optimize the numbers to impress investors. I nodded toward the auditors. One of them started the projector and walked the room through it, crisp and sharp. Edit trails, email evidence, report versions, a timeline matching every one of Ethan's directives. When the emails flashed on the screen, someone whispered, "My God." Ethan stepped forward half a pace, his voice cracking. "That's a misunderstanding. Just formatting." I didn't let him build another excuse. I opened another folder. "The $18 million contract he signed on his own," I said. with a clause that could cost this company $12 million if the other party fails its commitments. I slid the copy toward the board. Someone frowned. Why was this contract never submitted to us? I didn't answer. And Ethan couldn't. His face went pale, his lips pressed tight as if he couldn't find a single word. Then I took out the last item, a small silver USB. And one more thing, I said, plugging it into the projector. Recordings from recent meetings. Ethan's voice filled the room, clear as daylight. We can't let the old generation hold us back. The company needs vision, not memories. When I become CEO, everything changes, including him. Silence dropped like a weight. Someone stood up. Someone else stared at Ethan as if seeing him for the first time. Ethan looked at me, eyes wide with panic. Not because the truth was out, but because he couldn't understand how I'd known every step he took. The chair placed both hands on the table. Ethan Hale is suspended from all positions until the investigation is complete, effective immediately. Ethan looked at me again, lips trembling, as if wanting to ask something or blame something. But I met his gaze, with nothing more than a quiet stillness, the look of a father who has endured enough to stop yielding. The door closed behind him, and the room suddenly felt larger, quieter, as if the walls themselves finally exhaled, after holding their breath for far too long. The internal investigation began the very next morning. I didn't sit in on any of the committee meetings. I just stayed in my old office, looking out at the blurry parking lot through the glass. But every report sent to the board found its way to me, a quiet acknowledgement that I wasn't the one who started this crisis. The $18 million contract was paused, then canceled. The risky clause that had been hidden was reviewed again, and by mid-afternoon the company had escaped a $12 million loss. The board exhaled. A few members stopped by to thank me, soft voices, hesitant, like they still weren't used to standing on my side after weeks of uncertainty. The press jumped on the story. Headlines filled the financial pages: Hale heir suspended, accused of falsifying reports, leadership crisis at Hale and Company. And then, as always, the same people who had praised Ethan began to turn away. The compliments vanished overnight. His phone stopped ringing. Those eager young allies, who once stood proudly behind him, went silent. That evening, when the rain came down hard, I heard footsteps on the walkway. When I opened the door, Ethan was standing there, soaked from head to toe, hands hanging by his sides, his face hollow, like he'd survived a storm far worse than the one falling around him. "Dad," he said, his voice rough and low. "I didn't mean for things to end like this." I stood in the doorway, the cold wind brushing across my face. I opened the door just wide enough to see him clearly, but not wide enough to let him in. "Ethan," I said, each word slow and heavy. "You wanted to replace me, but you don't understand the weight I've carried for 40 years. He lowered his head. His shoulders trembled, whether from the rain or something else, I couldn't tell. I didn't say more. No blame. No comfort. Some fractures, once made, can't be sealed with a few words of regret. Ethan left after a few minutes, his footsteps dragging across the wet stone. I watched him go, silent. He had lost something money could never buy back: my trust. After the crisis, the board asked me to return as interim CEO, the seat I'd once stepped away from, hoping to give the next generation room to lead. I accepted, not for prestige, but because the company needed stability. Those first days back, I walked into my old office with a strange heaviness. Everything looked the same. Only the people had changed. Under new oversight and tighter auditing processes, the company slowly settled again. Partners who had been wary returned to the negotiation table. Meetings grew calmer. The whole place felt like a river easing back after a hard tide. Ethan left the company soon after. The board required him to enter mandatory counseling and barred him from any management position for 3 years. A harsh decision, but a necessary one. I heard he's now living quietly in a small coastal town, far from reporters and curious eyes. I haven't gone to see him, not because I've given up, but because I know some wounds need more time than a father's presence can give. I still love my son. That love doesn't vanish because of mistakes. But to be close to him again, to trust him again, that's something I can't do just yet. All my life, I've believed one thing. An empire isn't built on ambition, but on discipline and honesty. And betrayal doesn't always come from outsiders. Sometimes it comes from someone who carries your own name. Before I close this story, let me ask you something. Do you think I should give Ethan a second chance? If this story made you think, Like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next ones. Thank you for staying with me till the end.